Now we are going to look at indexing with pandas. In Python, as we know, we can do some indexing with certain data structures like lists, for example. If we have a list of different items, we can access the value in these items by the index, that is the position of those items in the list. The same rule is applicable to pandas. In pandas, we have two major ways of indexing. We have the .lock method, which is label-based indexing, and the second one is the .ilock method, which is integer-based indexing. You can basically see the difference between these two as when we are using .ilock, we use the label. The label in this case, for example, is the columns, the value of the columns, the column names, while the .ilock use integer, that is, we use the positioning of the columns, for example, to index, that is to extract certain rows, certain columns from our data frame. This shows a refresher of what our data looks like. For example, I have tried to just show you again using the .head method, the first 5 rows of this data frame. And we have different columns as we know earlier. Now, using the .lock method, remember I said the .lock method used the label-based indexing, that is the column name. However, the .lock method also takes in the first argument as the rows values. That is, for example, in this case, we are passing in a range of the rows that we want. This is essentially saying we want you to return the first 5 rows of the quantity ordered column. In this case, we are not returning all the column. We are using the .lock method to return the first 5 rows of the quantity ordered column. And that is exactly what we see here. How can we do this with the .ilock method? It's almost the same except from some slight changes. As we see here, we are using the indexing, that is I. So this I is like index location. This is just location and it's used the label. You would also see that there is a slight difference and between the rows that we are returning. When we use the .ilock method, we should note that it doesn't return the last value. So what that means is, unlike here, where we are starting with index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and we have gotten the first 5 rows, for the .ilock method, we need to pass in the very last row as well. We need to pass in the first 5 rows in the .ilock method. So bear this in mind. The major difference is not just the rows that we are returning as we see here, but also that this uses the column name and this uses position of that column. And as we know, the very first column here is 0, which is ordered number. And the second column is index 1, quantity ordered. And that is where we have passed the value of 1 in here. Moving on, we are going to see slight differences between how we get the same data using the .log method and the .ilock method. For example, we want to return the first 5 rows for multiple columns. It's the same thing that we have seen earlier, except that instead of passing it as a string here, we are passing the multiple of our columns inside a list. That is the basic difference between what we've seen earlier, because now we want it to return 2 columns for us rather than 1.
Hello there. If you have enjoyed this course so far, kindly support me and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Subscribe will also help you know when newer courses are released. Thank you for subscribing. I do hope you have. Let's carry on with the course.
Moving to the .ilock method, you should already get familiar with this. We pass in that same list, but this time around, we pass in the integer position of this particular column. Let's go up and find where sales is. We already know that quantity ordered is in index 1. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is why here we have passed in the number 4 to get the sales column. That is the major difference between the log and the .iloc method. And here we would see that if we want to select all the rows, instead of here where we have passed in the range of the rows, we just use this attribute, which is just passing in the column. When we pass in the column in the first argument, we are saying we want to return all the rows for these columns. In the .iloc method, is the same, except that as usual, we pass in the integer positions of the columns. I'm also going to show you how you can get the row with the maximum quantity ordered, for instance. For the .loc method, we first of all pass in the data frame with the particular column that we want to return and the maximum quantity. So for example, we want to know in the rows of this quantity ordered, which row has the maximum quantity. And as we would see here, it has returned the whole data frame, that is each value of the column for that particular row. That is essentially what we have returned here. So it's returned all the columns of the data frame for which the quantity ordered is the maximum in the entire data set. The same thing can be done with iloc, except that as usual, we pass in the integer position. Now we are going to see how filtering is done. If you are familiar with SQL, sometimes in our tables, we are filtering the rows that we want to select from our table by some criteria. The same thing can be done with .log and even .iloc, which we will see in a moment. In this case, I am selecting multiple conditions where I am checking when the status has been shipped, that is the order has been shipped, and the sales, that is the price or the payment that was made by the customer, is greater or equal to 2,000. As we see, I am only selecting the sales column. So I want it to return just the sales column when these two conditions are met using the .loc method. And that is what we have here. It returns just the sales that are greater or equal to 2,000, and the status is that they have been shipped. Now, let's see how the same thing is done with .iloc. With .iloc, we have the same thing being replicated, but slight changes. Number one, as we are already familiar with, is that we use the .iloc method, we pass it into the old data frame, and we select that particular column by the indexing. And we check for each row when it is shipped. That is why we have this column in front of this. Remember, this selects all the rows. Now, this column here is the same thing as here. We know that the index position of the sales column is 4, and we are checking when it's greater than 2,000. We are then saying we want to just return the sales. Now, let me show you something. If we are not returning the sales, what will happen is that it returns all of the rows with the column names that fulfill that criteria. This is because we have not selected by the column that we wanted. So this would return all of the rows in the data frame that has fulfilled this criteria. But what we want is just the sales. So we just index that by the column name. And I have a little exercise that you can play with. Make sure you do all of this exercise using .log and the .iloc method. I've also created this bonus course that you are going to see in the next video.
Hello there. If you have enjoyed this course so far, kindly support me and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Subscribe will also help you know when newer courses are released. Thank you for subscribing. I do hope you have. Let's carry on with the course.